Hi ToneBase, this is Leanne, and I am here to help you with a 2-week intensive on sight reading. And I'm really excited to be talking to you about sight reading because it's one of those things that no matter what level you're at, I have been there. I have been that person that cannot sight read past a measure. I have been that person that has been in the hot seat trying to sight read in front of juries. I've also been that person that's been teaching sight reading when I was teaching at a Juilliard. So no matter where you are in your sight reading journey, I've been there before. So I'm excited to kind of meet all of you where you're at and hopefully give you some wonderful pointers to get to that next level. So the way that we're going to break up this sight reading into the 2 weeks is in this first week, I'm going to introduce you to my checklist that I developed from my own experiences in teaching myself to sight read and also in teaching so many students how to do so. It's been very effective for me even today to kind of revisit this checklist, and I found a lot of students found it very helpful. So hopefully you will as well, and it'll give you some guidance and some maybe some helpful hints that you haven't thought about before when approaching all of this. And on top of that, we're going to also, in the second week, start exploring how to sight read collaboratively. So if you're playing music with a friend, if you're doing chamber music, if you are playing at your church, if you are trying to be a collaborative pianist, playing auditions for singers, an opera pianist, you name it, how do you sight read when someone else is also trying to contribute to the music? And I think my checklist still is very effective. It's just that it expands a little bit because we have to consider a few more things. So we'll explore this checklist and how it applies to all the different elements of sight reading and kind of talk about how our sight reading will modify depending on what we're doing. But before we get started, I think it's important to talk about the 3 main reasons that we might sight read. And it sounds a little philosophical, like why am I sight reading? But it's actually really important to ask yourself, why am I sight reading at this exact moment? And that might change depending on what we're doing, depending on the scenario. But there's kind of 3 overarching reasons that one might sight read, right? So the first one is obviously fun and social. Think of the approaching holiday season, right? Someone wants to throw carols at you to play for the family caroling session. Or maybe it's your friend's birthday and you want to be able to have a variation happy birthday set put down and you can play it. Maybe you want to use it for worship music. Maybe you want to sight read your kid's favorite Disney song. The list goes on, right? But there's a lot of daily things where it's just nice to be able to say, hey, if you love that song, I would love to play that for you. So the fun social aspect, and also just personal, if you really love a piece and you just kind of want to play through it, right? The secondary thing is thinking about it from a professional level, right? If you really are a professional pianist or you're training to be one, you're at a collegiate level, even in your high school, there's a lot of scenarios where you're going to be asked to sight read in a very high stakes environment. I had many times in my life where another pianist didn't show up and a singer said, here's my score, can you sight read for me? I'm next, right? And they're auditioning for something that's really important for their career. So how do I sight read in that moment? I've had scenarios where I've had violinists or trumpet players say, hey, I have a really important international competition next week. Can you learn these 2-3 hours of repertoire for me? Right? So even though I had some practice time, I really had to rely on my sight reading skills to be able to rehearse with them because I only had a couple days, right? And I had my other things going on too. So how are you able to sight read professionally to where you could be that collaborative pianist backstage, just playing repertoire right away, new person, maybe you didn't even have a rehearsal time. So lots of professional situations that you would need that for, especially a lot of liturgical music as well, right? Having to change the program last minute, list goes on. And I think the third kind of overarching reason is also just personal practice, right? So the better that you are at sight reading, the faster and more effectively you're going to learn your solo repertoire or, even collaborative repertoire like concerti or any kind of chamber music you're learning. Simply because The first time you play through a piece, you're going to be able to feel the piece better. You're going to be able to not instill bad technique. And I think that's the primary key. So if you think about most times when we're reading through a piece for the first time, it's very easy to kind of play and, oh, made a note mistake. And all of a sudden I had to stop because this part's a little too fast or too hard. And maybe I kind of play a couple notes and then I stop, and then I play a couple notes and I stop. Right? And doing that once, not the end of the world, right? We all make mistakes. But if that's kind of how I'm approaching the piece again and again, right? Maybe I accidentally make that same note mistake a lot of times when I'm learning the piece. Or maybe I keep hesitating here, or I kind of freeze a little bit because I have to read the next thing, right? The more that we have to kind of pause or freeze for a second to read that next thing, it goes into our muscle memory. And a lot of times that's the kind of stuff we have to undo later, right? You have your teacher tell you to relax or to release your tension or to drop or all of these things. And it's like, well, how did I get so tense to begin with? Well, sometimes it's how we're learning it, right? Because we didn't just play through everything and it didn't feel fluid the first time. So those are kinds of the big three overarching elements that kind of go into sight reading. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a checklist, looking at a Haydn sonata to start off for this first week. And then the next week, like I said, we're going to start looking at how we can expand that checklist to be a little bit more collaborative. So let's jump in. What we're doing now is we're looking at how the checklist works when we're just learning a solo piece for ourselves. So the first thing that we want to do is to ask ourselves, realistically, what are we aiming for? Okay. And this is really important to kind of decide, realistically, what do I think I'm going to play? And just to say play it perfectly, probably not realistic, right? We haven't looked at this piece before. It's also important to say, okay, how much time am I going to really spend and limit myself to before I play this? Because that can change, right? If I have only a few seconds before I play with somebody, that's a whole lot different than if I have a week to just look at something before I ever touch the keys, right? So I'm going to say that maybe I have a couple minutes, maybe before a lesson, maybe before just with my own practice time that I've allotted myself. And realistically, I think that the most important thing is to get a feel of the music and to not tense anywhere. So that might mean that I'm really focusing mostly on the rhythmic aspect, feeling the beat, feeling the textures, and getting a sense for what the music is going to feel like. Okay, so notice I didn't say perfection. I didn't say hit every single note right? That's not the goal with sight reading. And that's the thing that was hardest for me, is for me, I wanted to play everything perfectly, right? I hated making a mistake with a note. And that's what was really hard, is I would make a mistake and I'd have to go back and go back. Can't do that. Okay, so set a realistic goal for yourself. No, it's not going to be perfect. What's the idea? So now let's go to the music. We have our expectations set. And now the second step is to state the basics out loud, which for a lot of students, this feels very tedious. And this is where a lot of people kind of try to skip. But I promise you it is worth it to not skip this step. So examples of basics. I see that the piece is in C major. I see that the piece is in cut time. I find that interesting because as I look through the piece, I see that a lot of times I see 4 quarter notes. So that'll already give me a musical indication that although I can see that I might be kind of reading as though it's in 4/4, I need to feel the music a little bit more in 2 to feel that cut time. Also, I see that the clef is going to change. So it starts off with my bass and treble clef, but I see that very quickly it switches to treble clef. And that right there is one example of something that probably would trip up a lot of people when they were sight reading this initially, is that if I just started at the beginning and started reading, right, that might come as a little bit of a shock and then throw me off at that moment. So that's a very good example of why it's good to just state the basics, right? What is it at its element that I see in the piece? The third step is identify the hardest and easiest part. So this will differ kind of depending on maybe what's hard or easy for you, but in general, look for the part that's hardest to count, right? Or the part that looks like it's fastest. Those are kind of some basics just that generally we might want to look out for. So things that might be hard for me. Well, I see that there's some grace notes, right? Sometimes ornaments in general can make us fumble a little bit. So that's something to keep in mind. I also see, okay, I see triplets and I see that there's differing rhythms. Like here's a 4 against 3. So if I struggle with polyrhythms, right, that's something I'd be a little bit hesitant about. Maybe chords are a little more difficult for me versus single notes. So maybe this would be a measure that would be a little bit more difficult. So you can see, right, it depends on your own preference, but I'm just noticing parts that are a little harder. Well, what about easy parts? Well, anything that I didn't really circle is okay, right? Especially maybe here in this first measure, right? Simple notes, repeated notes. Maybe something like this where it's a little bit more patterned is a little easier. So depending, again, whatever seems to be a little bit more simple for you might be something you'd consider easy. The left hand here definitely seems a little simpler to me. Why? Well, look, the chord doesn't change. And in fact, it only changes until here. So you see how I've already now kind of visually identified places that are going to be a little trickier, and then some things where maybe I can just take a little bit of a back seat. I don't have to really focus on my left hand here. Whereas I might really need to focus on certain elements here in order to play that. And now that I've identified some of my hard parts, now the challenge is, can I simplify them? Okay, realistically simplify them. So this is something that will change as you become more advanced. So if I am a beginning pianist, I might say, realistically, some of these parts that have more dense chords, I don't know if I'm going to be able to play that right off the bat. I don't know if I can play these polyrhythms right off the bat. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start out and say, okay, now that I know what my hard parts are, let's just kind of clean up my score here, right? You don't have to. I'm just doing it for our simplicity. I'm going to get rid of all my grace notes. So I'm going to just pretend they don't exist. You don't have to actually write it in. I'm just thinking that this is a great way to kind of visually show you I'm a visual learner, right? Got rid of some of that. And then now let's tackle maybe some of these chords. Well, that looks really dense. So what I'm going to do instead is I think I'm just going to prioritize the melody. Okay, and I actually might just circle that, right? I'm going to say, okay, that's what I'm going to focus on. Maybe if I'm feeling really good about it, let's try to simplify. Instead of playing this whole chord, well, is there anything easy about it? Well, I'm noticing the bottom note just stays the same. So maybe I'll just try to play G, and I'll even write the letter G for myself in big letters so I know what to do there. Okay, I'll just play some G's there in the left hand to get a sense of the harmony. But I'm already kind of getting rid of all of the hard stuff that I might not be able to do right off the bat if I'm a beginner pianist. Okay, then I get here, maybe doing something similar, right? Stick with the melody. And then this is a little tricky, right? Because we don't have any notes that stay common. So maybe I just stick with that right there. Maybe I'm a little more intermediate and it's just the timing, the speed that's hard here. So something I can do is maybe, since those chords repeat, maybe I'll just get rid of the second one. In essence, giving me more time to play each chord here. And that way I have more time to switch my hand. Maybe jumping forward when I have these polyrhythms. Well, I already kind of have the sense of this chord because I've been playing it for 3 measures, right? Maybe I'll just leave it out right here so I can focus on that right hand again so I can just hear that melody. So you can see that actually what we're talking about is some pretty advanced music theory concepts, right? We're identifying melody versus harmony. We're trying to distill elements out of the score. So here, well, I'm going to use what we call it kind of like that, almost like a pedal point, right? That same note, even though it's not technically a pedal point in theory terms, right? But just like keeping on that same note, really focusing on the melody. Here, giving us more time. So we're in a way kind of recomposing as we sight read, trying to keep the true essence of the score, the most important parts, but then trying to just kind of take stuff out of the picture so that we can more accurately play. If I instead just tried to kind of barrel through here, right, I might end up making more mistakes. I basically might have to like stop and find the chord and then stop and then find the chord. It's a lot better for my technique and for my understanding of the piece to feel the flow, to feel the feeling of two, to feel the melody in that pacing with the melody, with maybe one note, rather than freeze play, freeze play. I'll have plenty of time to go back and learn those notes, all of which will eventually be important. Okay, and then now, let's say that I just want to take one more minute. What I might do is, with whatever time I've allowed myself, I want to just tap and sing parts to kind of feel the beat of the piece, right? Or to feel the essence of the piece. So especially with this triplet, right? Maybe triplets are kind of new to you. I might spend my time prioritizing feeling this in the beat, right? So thinking, okay, 1 and 2 and 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, right? Something like that. Because that's hard, right? This looks like it's in 4, but we have to feel it in 2. How do we do that, right? So kind of spending some time silently tapping your foot or singing it out loud. All of that will kind of prepare you for what that should feel like when you go to play it. So now it's your turn for your assignment to use the checklist on a piece of your choice. So pick something that's not too long, right? Maybe stick for about like 8 to 12 measures at most. If you want to do even shorter, that's great. It can be as easy or as hard as you want. And what you're going to do is you're going to, after you do the whole process yourself, right at home, share with us, in a similar format to what I did, your score, and maybe point out 1 or 2 things that really stood out to you, right? Like something that you're going to try to leave out, something that you wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't gone through the checklist, right? The hard part, the easy part, how are you going to simplify? That's the hardest part, right? How are you going to simplify the hard part? Talk us through that, and then try sight reading it for us. I'll add that little bit of extra pressure when you're sight reading to see if you could do it, right, under pressure. So good luck with that this week, and I look forward to seeing your videos and giving you some comments to help you continue utilizing this checklist. And I'll see you in the next video to help you learn how to apply all of this to some collaboration.